All right. My grandma used to always say,
When you know how to do it, it's easy.
and yes, building a DIY subfloor for your van is relatively easy. However, there are 3 steps that you don't want to miss to avoid floorboard rot, to prevent your floorboards from separating when you step on them, and of course to avoid those dreaded van squeaks that we all hate. So let's get into it. What up, friends? In this video, we're going to show you how we built our subfloor for our Ford Transit. We're really stoked on how this floor turned out because it is relatively well insulated and it didn't cut into the headroom too much. Oh, side note, we haven't decided on a name for our van yet, so if you have any suggestions, please submit those in the comments below. All right, what is in store for the video today? Let's take a look. The agenda is as follows. First, we're going to take a look at the layers of the floor. Second, we're going to take a look at the process or show you how we put the whole thing together. And third, we're going to talk about the final cost of all of the materials. Okay, layers of the subfloor. The first layer is a 1/2-inch plywood, and it is best if it's a marine grade plywood. Marine grade means that they use some type of water resistant glue between the plies. If you can't find marine grade plywood, then just use your basic regular CDX plywood or BCX plywood, whatever you have available. That's what we used. This 1/2-inch plywood is going to be cut into strips that will go into the channels of the floor so that the floorboard on top can screw into it. Think of this as like the base of the floor that everything else gets screwed into. The next layer is 1-inch XPS foam. The R value for 1-inch XPS foam is R3. Its minimum compressive strength is 15 psi, meaning it's plenty strong to withstand pressure of people standing on a floorboard above. The third and final layer is 1/2-inch birch plywood. A lot of van builders use Baltic birch plywood, and I'm not sure if it's because we're in California and Arizona, but I have had a hard time finding birch plywood from the Baltic region. So we just bought 1/2-inch birch plywood. So maybe that's a Canada thing or an East Coast thing, but Baltic birch, not really able to find it. To join your floorboard together, your birch plywood floorboard together, it's best to create a 1/2 lap joint and glue that joint together. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to explain more of that in the video later on. Step 1 is to water seal your 1/2-inch plywood that we're going to put into the channels as a base to screw into. There are various products that seal wood, and there are a few considerations to take before you decide on what the product is, but the main consideration is dry time. We used a mildew resistant primer, which was awesome until it took 3 or 4 days for each layer of paint to dry, which was crappy because it took so much space in our work area to let these pieces of wood dry. Here's a tip though, a reminder maybe, don't rush the painting process. If you don't put on light coats or wait long enough between coats for each of those coats to dry, then they never will. The paint will basically never dry. It will stay tacky forever. And because we were sort of having this issue, we halfway through the project switched to Thompson's water sealer. This stuff felt sort of like a shellac or a varnish of some type, and it just dried faster and was easy to work with, so I enjoyed using that. All right, after you've sealed your wood with your primer or your Thompson's water sealer, cut the wood into strips or portions to line the channels of your van floor, and glue those down with marine grade caulking glue. And this is the brand that we used. I've seen some fellow YouTubers use cinder blocks or weights or other heavy objects to put pressure on the wooden slats as they dried to make sure they glued down properly. But I didn't really have those resources, so what I ended up doing was just walking on each of them and using my body weight to keep them down as they sort of set. And they weren't dried completely, but it allowed them to stick fully, and I think they glued down just fine. Looking back, I think I used a lot of glue. I went pretty heavy on the glue, and I recommend that because You might use an extra bottle, but then everything's glued down really, really nicely. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, tip on this. Number each of your wooden slats, those portions that you cut, and then number the floor with a marker below that slat, because you don't want to mix them up as you shuffle them around if you have to move anything, and you're gonna cut probably 40 or 50 of these, and it'll be nice if they're all organized, so don't forget to number them. Now we're on to the second layer of the subfloor. The 1-inch XPS foam board. We used 4 4x8 sheets of Owens Corning brand Pink Panther XPS foam board. Wow, that was a mouthful. Here's a little side story. We were looking all over for 1/2-inch XPS foam board because that's what we thought we originally wanted, and we couldn't find any within like a 300-mile radius of where we are. So we went for what they have, which was the 1-inch XPS foam board, and we're actually really glad we did because it has a higher compressive strength rating and a higher R value. Yes, we lost 1/2 inch of headroom, but we still have plenty of headroom. I think our ceiling is 6'3", and that's just enough for us. So I created a template of the floor around the wheel well and some of the curves of the floor using a contour gauge. Once you have your template created, lay that template down on your XPS foam board. When you lay it down, trace it of course, and then cut it with a box cutter. I do recommend using a mask, however, I did not use one as much as I should. And then next thing you do is lay down the foam board that you just cut to size. I didn't glue the foam board down, and I don't think you really need to. After that, grab your 4 4x8 sheets of plywood and create your half lap joints. A half lap joint is a joint that prevents 2 pieces of wood from separating under force or pressure. It looks like this. In our situation, our application here, you're gonna cut away half of your 1/2-inch plywood, creating a little ledge. And you do this using a router tool. I used a 1/2-inch router bit. What you do is you adjust the router bit so it protrudes about a 1/4 inch, therefore cutting away half of the plywood's thickness, thus creating a half lap joint. That sounded so formal, didn't it? Protruding a 1/4 inch. Thus, therefore, furthermore, do this to all edges of your 4 sheets of 4x8 plywood except for the back edge and the front edge that faces the seats. After that, take your 4 4x8 sheets of plywood, lay them down, and make sure they fit properly. When they're all laid down together, go ahead and use your template, the one that you cut out your foam board with, and cut out the floorboard with that template. Before we move on, here is that tip I was telling you about to prevent squeaking. When you cut your foam board and your plywood floorboard, don't cut them to fit snugly in the van. Give yourself like 1 inch away from the van wall or the wheel well or the side. This is so that those materials won't rub against the wheel well or the wall when the van is driving. It'll prevent the squeaking. Of course, you'll want to seal that later, but you can use some foam spray later to seal those edges. We didn't do this, and I've already experienced some squeaking just driving it to Home Depot and back, so I gotta go back and figure out some way of fixing that. Now that you've cut your floorboards, what you have to do is glue them down on top of your foam board while you glue the floorboards together in the half lap joints. This is pretty tricky to do at the same time. So if you have a partner or a homie or a friend that you can call over to help you with this, it makes it quite a bit easier. You're gonna wanna glue the floorboard, the wood, the plywood, to the foam board using a foam board adhesive. I feel like I've said foam board and plywood or floorboard like 1 billion times in this video. As you're gluing down your plywood to your foam, you're gonna wanna be snugging your half lap joint together and gluing that at the same time. We used a marine epoxy for this. We got this idea from a fellow YouTuber, Mr. 70 Savage, and we did some research ourselves, and after we did, we realized it was a pretty good idea, and so far it's worked out wonderful. It's really strong and works great. Now that you laid the flooring, it is time to screw it down. And this is where I sort of messed up. I tried marking the wood, the floor, where those wooden slats were, and apparently I didn't do a good enough job because I missed a bunch of those wooden slats. So I put tons of holes in the floorboard, more or less looking for where the wooden slats were. It was like incredibly frustrating, but it worked out in the end. And here's another tip. Pre-drill your holes using a countersink drill bit. This will allow your screws to lay flush or even below the floor so those screw heads don't stick up. I used 1 3/4 inch deck screws for this. I'd like to admit something before we move on. I didn't really know what type of screw to use for this application. I thought that I wanted a screw that had full thread so that when I screwed down the floor, the board wouldn't move along the screw. Those threads that were along the entire body of the screw would make it so that under pressure there'd be no sinking or wiggling. At least this was my thinking. But now that I'm thinking about it, I wonder if like a pocket screw would have been better, where there's no threads toward the head, and that would potentially pull the floorboard down since it just slides along that part of the screw. I'm not really sure. Again, if you know the best screw for this project, please leave the info in the comments below. That'll help us and everyone for future projects. Final step was to fill in those holes that I made with all those screws with some floor patch stuff. I got this idea from Moser Makes, this other YouTuber that has been building vans and making videos for a long time. I've been following him for years and I totally dig his style. So I don't know if this is the best material for patching floors, but it worked really well, and after I sanded it, it turned out smooth like butter.
Why are you taking a video of me cutting the butter?
Because you're gonna be in the video.
Have you told them about the total cost yet?
Oh, shit. I completely forgot to tell you the total cost of the subfloor. So let's go over the price of the materials and then we'll get to the total. 3 sheets of 1/2 inch birch plywood cost $275.62. 4 bottles of that Loctite marine adhesive was $69.92. 4 bottles of the foam board adhesive was $22.32. 1.5 sheets of 1/2 inch basic plywood was $77.77. And then there were 2 boxes of 1 3/4 inch screws, totaling $25.94. And then got, I think it was a gallon of Thompson's water seal. In the video I showed you the spray can, but I think we ended up getting a gallon of that Thompson's water seal. And that was $14.48. And the total being $486.55. All right, click the like button if you found the video helpful, and please press subscribe if you want to see more of our videos coming up.